After the killing of George Floyd, a black man who was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Black Lives Matter movement has turned up the heat to address racism in the United States. The world seemed to take up the cause and began protests of their own. Canadians also began looking at themselves in the mirror, wondering if we too have racist issues in our own country. Joining me now to talk about this very important issue is Dr. Edna Djokoto-Asem, a sociologist with Athabasca University here in Lethbridge. Dr. Asem, welcome to BCN.
I am happy to be with you, Hal.
That's wonderful. Do you mind if I call you Edna? Is that okay?
That's fine. You can call me Edna.
Thank you, Edna. Now, people across the world see Canada as a country that accepts a lot of cultures. But is it really? What are your thoughts about racism here in our country, Canada?
Racism, the word is actually very tricky in the sense that the way that people define it can influence how they perceive and explain it. So I realized that since the George Floyd incidents, there have been terms that have been thrown around like systemic racism and institutional racism, and people don't quite know, I think, what they mean. And I think that has influenced the way people have been talking about race and race relations in Canada. So I think when we say racism is systemic, it actually means that it's something that is unconscious. It's not something that is done on purpose. So from that angle, you can say that there are elements of it in Canadian society in the sense that you don't really see it. People don't intend to be racist, but then they are racist in their consequences. So the effect on people is racist, but then the people who are intending that act may not think that it's racist or it's conscious.
So, Edna, what country did you come from originally?
Originally from Ghana in West Africa.
Oh, Ghana. Okay, wonderful. So, when you came to Canada, did you yourself experience racism?
Yes, I did. Actually, I did on several occasions, and I continue to do, but it's just my reaction to it that is completely different now than then because I felt it's not in your face, it's more subtle about the way people go about it. And I think in most cases, people are actually not conscious about it. I mean, there are instances where you know it's racial profiling. For example, if you walk into the grocery store and the security guard follows you around, which has happened to me several times, but I mean, you just take it in strides and walk away. If you want to confront, you can, but I tend not to want to confront. So sometimes I turn it into a game. But initially, it bothered me. And I actually remember an incident in Edmonton where I literally ran out of the store and I was hyperventilating. Like I was so upset. And I thought, am I going to die because of someone's ignorance? I'm not going to. Just think about it. So I made a decision that when I encountered such challenges, if I want to confront the people, I'll confront them. If I don't want to, I'll just let it go. So that is how I have dealt with it.
Now, some would say here in Western Canada as well, Edna, that racism may also lean a little bit towards Indigenous or First Nations peoples. What are your thoughts?
I think so. And this in the past, was institutionalized in the sense that they were in residential schools. But now is systemic in the sense that in most cases you think it's unconscious, it's not something that is deliberate, but is deliberate in the consequences. So for example, if they have First Nations people have a very high rate of incarceration in our prison system. Meanwhile, they are a very small fraction of our population. So that is one way you can determine that there's something going on. So the reason is, why do they have high rate of incarceration? So then you have to begin to investigate. Is it because they are involved in all these crimes? And that is not to say there are no other crimes, but it just means that they are more likely to be prosecuted than other so-called white-collar crimes that are more difficult to prosecute.
So, what can we do as a country then as we work towards reconciliation with our First Nations peoples?
I think The first part is actually recognizing the problem, and I think there's that recognition, but it's the next step that is a challenge because I think that there has to be engagement and we have to be able to engage. And I don't think that people are ready to engage because when you try to engage, sometimes you don't know the words to use. And if you use the wrong word, you could get into trouble. So I think that makes people hesitant to be able to engage and discuss some of these issues.
Edna, I've spoken to some black community leaders here who are not fans of the group Black Lives Matter, saying BLM has an agenda that does not align with their own beliefs. How do you respond to that?
I think that we have to make a distinction between the organization and the phrase, because when you say Black Lives Matter, the organization, obviously they have things that they stand for that some people are uncomfortable with. But when you use the phrase Black Lives Matter, there are lots of people that support that because they think that, when you look at the racial injustice, especially George Floyd and others who have experienced such just inhumane treatment, they want to be supportive of that, but they are not necessarily supportive of the organization. So I think it's important to be able to make that distinction to say, even if you do not support the organization, you support the phrase, the idea, the concept that, all humans are created equal and they require some form of justice in our society.
Amen. I like how you separated the phrase from the actual group itself. If you don't really agree
Yeah,
with their ideologies, right? We all believe that, yes,
yeah.
Black Lives Matter, you bet. It's important to take a good, close, hard look at ourselves and our actions, but should companies like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's be changing their brands to follow a trend right now?
That's a good question. I think when you look at Aunt Jemima, for example, you look at the history of it. Obviously, there are racist undertones, but over the years, they've tried and worked very hard to reform that image. And it's actually interesting that you brought that up because when they wanted to change their name, Aunt Jemima's relatives were not very happy. They felt they were not consulted. So it gets a little bit complicated when you begin to look at sort of the interpersonal level of some of these debates, because on sort of the macro level, you have all these movements, people calling for change. And then on the micro level, you have the family, the extended family saying, well, we know that this is the history, but we still want that connection. So I think there's a need for engagement to be able to figure out how we move forward, because definitely that racist, the history is racist. So to move forward, we need to just engage with each other and decide and take it case by case. I think it's very, very important that, we listen to all sides and engage. That's very, very important. We have to engage.
I watched this video last week of this young black man. He had Aunt Jemima pancakes, Aunt Jemima syrup. He's eating. He said, "This is what racism tastes like. I like it." Like, and it went viral, right? 3 million people watched it, and they're all like, "That's great." Now, how about professional sports teams like the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Indians? How important is it for them, Edna, to change their team names?
If you think about the Redskins, of course, some people are very upset because they think it's cultural appropriation. But then there are two questions that you have to ask yourself. The A, who benefits from keeping the name? And then two, what discussion is going on to actually figure out what to do? Because you can easily jump on the bandwagon and say, okay, let's get rid of it. But on the other hand, is there a constructive dialogue going on with the different groups that are involved to figure out how to go forward? Because do we need to talk about this and think, okay, this is part of the history, but we don't need it now. What do we do with that name? Or do we try to find out just the different groups involved and figure out what to do? I know you asked about American teams, but I'm so tempted to talk about the Edmonton Eskimos because it's closer to home, right? And I think that when it comes to the Eskimos, it's a little bit more complicated because I know media reports always talk about, oh, people want it changed. But then when you look at their situation, it's a bit more complicated in the sense that you have different groups involved. You have some leaders from the Inuit community who want to change, and then others who don't want to change. So, what do you do as the owner of the team? Do you say, okay, who am I going to listen to? And I think this is where dialogue comes in. This is where engagement comes in, because obviously some people want to keep it, and some people think it's cultural appropriation. So, this is where engagement is very, very important.
Now, there are also calls for statues to be torn down and the names of schools changed, not just in the United States, but Canada as well. Can racism really be addressed without throwing out the baby with the bathwater?
I think this is where we need to deal with these issues on case by case basis and try to dialogue, because we don't want to completely say, okay, these people never existed, because God knows, we all make mistakes, right? But if it's associated with slavery, then the community has to come together and say, okay, you know what? This belongs to a museum. This statue belongs to a museum. We want it to be in the museum, not in the central part of the city where everyone walks in and sees this hero on a horse or whatever. But then we want this statue in a museum so we can have, an interpreter just trying to describe, or you have, written information so that people can better understand why that statue exists. Because I think it's very, very important for us not to erase the past because it's inconsistent with today's values. I think it's very, very important, because if you erase that, then we would never know that there was this slave owner who existed. We will never know. So I personally believe that yes, something should be done about those statues, but the community will have to decide whether it belongs in a museum. I don't want them to disappear completely, because people would never know what those people did. And I think it's very, very important that we know what they did in the past.
You know, some people say if you remove the statues and any memories of the history, you're bound to repeat it. So they're there for a reason. So moving forward, Edna, where do you think we should go as a society, especially here in Canada and in Alberta, when it comes to dealing with racism?
I think we can do several things, but I'll just talk about two. The first one, I think, is engagement. I think engagement is very, very important, especially because racism, as we see today, is systemic in the sense that it's unconscious and it's unintentional. So, for example, in Ontario this week, they decided that they were going to stop streaming grade 9 students. Now, when that policy originally was implemented, I don't think they thought that it was going to have that consequence on people. So they figured it out years later that this is a problem, let's address it. So I think at the policy level, anytime there's a policy implemented, there has to be evaluation after a couple of years to try to figure out the impact of that particular policy on groups of people. And at the micro level, like among people, interpersonal relationships, you can easily misunderstand someone's actions and term it racist, especially if it's systemic, because it's unconscious. They are not really thinking about it. Let me give you an example. If I walk into a shop and then someone meets me and says, can I help you? I really don't mind. But some of my Black friends feel very offended for two reasons. One is that it means they are incapable of looking for what they are looking for, or they see it as, oh, it means you are watching me, you are putting me on notice that I'm being watched. Now, it's just different interpretations of the same thing. So until we are able to have that dialogue to know that, oh, if I say that, it may offend someone. So I don't have to talk that way, or I can ask the person, do you think this is offensive to you? That dialogue on the interpersonal level, I think, is very, very important, because if we don't talk about the difficult issues, there's no way we are going to be able to move forward. I mean, if you want to talk about race and your white friend doesn't want to talk about race because they are afraid of being labeled racist, then it becomes a problem. The other thing that I want to add is that once it's not illegal. Like if you say something and it's not illegal, we shouldn't throw people under the bus. We have to give them the benefit of the doubt because we are all humans. We make mistakes. So you could say something and it's very unconscious. You didn't even think that it was going to offend someone. And then you say it, and then the person gets offended. Then you say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but let's not call for the resignation of that public official because they didn't know." Like I said, it's systemic. It may be unconscious. It may not be on purpose. So let's give each other grace and say, you know what? You blew this one. You know, just apologize and let's move on. And once the people know that that particular phrase or their action is offensive, they are not going to repeat it. And let's get to know each other. Because sometimes people don't really know you and they prejudge you, and based on that, they have all these racial stereotypes. But once they get to know you, they realize that, oh, okay, our DNA is the same. Over 90%, we are all the same right underneath the skin. So it's just getting to know each other and working on the policy level as well.
You know, I'm reminded of a song when I was a kid. Red and yellow, black and white, they're all precious in his sight. Dr. Edna Djokoto-Asem, a sociologist with Athabasca University, thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Hal.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.